Welcome back to the Shadow Dossier. We walk the streets of Washington, D.C. today and see a city of marble and monuments, a grid of power and politics. We are told that the layout of the Capitol was designed to impress foreign dignitaries, to reflect the grandeur of Paris, and to symbolize the stability of the new republic. We are told that the man who designed it, a French engineer named Pierre Charles L'Enfant, was a brilliant but difficult artist who was fired because he was too stubborn, too expensive, and too slow. That is the story they tell in the history books. But the archives of the Shadow Dossier reveal a different blueprint. Washington, D.C. was not designed to be a city. It was designed to be a machine. It is a colossal circuit board laid out across 10 square miles of Maryland swamp, built to channel the Earth's natural electromagnetic energy into a single focal point. Pierre Charles L'Enfant wasn't fired because he was over budget. He was fired because he tried to turn the machine on before the safety protocols were in place. The year is 1791. The United States is an infant nation, fragile and bankrupt. The Revolutionary War is over, but the air is still thick with the threat of reconquest. The British are watching from the sea. The Spanish are watching from the south. President George Washington knows that to survive against the empires of Europe, America needs more than just a constitution. It needs power. Not political power, but literal, metaphysical power. Washington turns to L'Enfant. They had served together at Valley Forge. Washington knew that L'Enfant was not just an engineer. He was a student of the French occult schools. He had studied the sacred geometry of the Templars and the druidic ley lines of Europe. Washington gave him a mandate that was never written down in the congressional record. He said, "Build me a Rome for the New World. Build me a capital that acts as a shield." L'Enfant arrives at the banks of the Potomac in March. It is a desolate place, a fog-choked wetland infested with mosquitoes and thick with briars. To a normal surveyor, it looks like a nightmare, but L'Enfant doesn't see mud. He sees a grid. He spends weeks surveying the land, not with a standard theodolite, but with a lodestone and dowsing rods. He maps the invisible rivers of energy, the telluric currents that run beneath the soil. He finds that the site chosen by Washington is not random. It is a convergence point, a natural battery waiting to be tapped. The indigenous tribes of the Piscataway had avoided the hill known as Jenkins Heights for centuries, calling it the place where the sky speaks to the ground. L'Enfant chooses this exact spot for the Capitol building. He retreats to a small shack in Georgetown and begins to draw. The plan he produces is baffling to the commissioners like Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson wants a simple grid, like a chessboard, logical, rational, easy to sell lots. But L'Enfant draws diagonals. He draws massive avenues that slice through the grid at odd angles. He creates circles and squares that intersect in ways that make no sense for traffic, but make perfect sense for energy conduction. He aligns the city not with the sun, but with the stars. Specifically, he aligns the main avenues with the constellation Virgo. Why Virgo? Because in the ancient mysteries, Virgo represents Isis, the Egyptian goddess of magic, resurrection, and the harvest. L'Enfant intends to harvest the cosmic energy of the stars and ground it into the federal city. The layout of Pennsylvania Avenue, connecting the Capitol to the White House, creates a specific geometric shape, a triangle. But if you look at the incomplete sections of his map, the parts he hid from Jefferson, the full design forms a pentagram. The White House sits at the apex. L'Enfant believes that if the architecture is perfect, the city itself will act as a resonance chamber. It will amplify the mental faculties of the leaders who live there. It will create a dome of protection against foreign invasion. It is the Apotheosis Project. The goal is to turn the president into a philosopher king, enlightened by the very geometry of his home. But L'Enfant is impatient. He is an artist, not a politician. He sees the potential of the grid, and he wants to test it. He becomes obsessed. He stops sleeping. He is seen wandering the swamps at night, talking to the air, measuring the distance between the stars and the mud. The conflict begins in the summer of 1791. A wealthy landowner named Daniel Carroll creates a problem. Carroll is powerful. He is related to the signers of the Declaration of Independence. He owns a large tract of land within the new district, and he decides to build a massive manor house. Unfortunately, Carroll decides to build his house exactly where L'Enfant had plotted one of his crucial energy conduits, what would later become New Jersey Avenue. To the city commissioners, this is a property dispute. To L'Enfant, it is a catastrophic engineering failure. He knows that if a heavy stone structure blocks the flow of the ley line, the machine will short-circuit. The energy gathering in the Capitol node will have nowhere to go. It could cause a feedback loop that would shatter the minds of anyone standing on Jenkins Hill. So L'Enfant orders Carroll to stop. Carroll refuses. The commissioners side with Carroll, citing property rights. So, on the night of November 22nd, L'Enfant takes matters into his own hands. He doesn't go to the courts. He gathers a crew of laborers under the cover of darkness. They don't just dismantle the house, they erase it. They tear it down to the foundation, clearing the path for the energy line. This is the event that history calls L'Enfant's folly. It is cited as the primary reason for his dismissal. History says he was an arrogant artist who didn't respect the law. But the Shadow Dossier reveals what actually happened later that night. L'Enfant didn't just tear down a house to make a street. He tore it down to attempt an activation. Having cleared the blockage, L'Enfant positioned large copper rods at the intersection of the Capitol Hill Mount and the White House site. He waited for the constellation Virgo to rise above the horizon. Specifically, he waited for the star Spica to align with the future location of the Washington Monument. At midnight, a storm rolled in off the Potomac. The atmosphere was charged with ozone. L'Enfant connected the rods using silver wire he had paid for out of his own pocket. Witnesses, slave laborers, and terrified assistants reported a low-frequency hum rising from the swamp. The water in Tiber Creek began to boil without heat. The air shimmered like a mirage. For a few terrifying seconds, the mud of the National Mall seemed to glow with a violet bioluminescence. L'Enfant stood in the rain, laughing, his arms raised. He was trying to jumpstart the heart of the nation. He wanted to prove to Washington that the machine worked, but the surge was too strong. The grid was incomplete. The Washington Monument, the central obelisk meant to act as the grounding rod, had not been built yet. Without the obelisk to vent the excess energy, the circuit overloaded. The ground shook violently. It wasn't an earthquake, it was a rejection. The energy backfired. A bolt of lightning didn't strike down, it struck up from the ground, incinerating the copper rods and throwing L'Enfant 20 feet into the mud. President Washington was awakened at Mount Vernon, miles away, by a sudden intense migraine and a feeling of overwhelming dread. He knew instinctively that L'Enfant had gone too far. The next morning, Thomas Jefferson summoned L'Enfant. Jefferson was a man of the Enlightenment, a man of reason. He feared what L'Enfant was building. He had seen the scorch marks on the mall. He had heard the stories of the glowing mud. He called it sorcery disguised as masonry. "You are building a city," Jefferson told him coldly, "not a temple." "It must be a temple," L'Enfant screamed, covered in mud and burns, his eyes wild with the residual energy of the ley lines. "The energy must flow, or it will rot the mind of this nation. You cannot put a cork in a volcano, Mr. Jefferson." Washington had no choice. He respected L'Enfant, but he couldn't have a mad wizard designing the Capitol. The risk was too great. If the public found out that the government was dabbling in geomancy, the fragile coalition of states would collapse. He fired him in February of 1792. But here is the twist. They fired the man, but they kept the map. Washington appointed Andrew Elliot to finish the job. Elliot was a surveyor, a practical man. He took L'Enfant's designs and sanitized them. He straightened some lines. He removed the overt occult symbols. The foundation. It was too late to change it. The machine was built. It just wasn't turned on. L'Enfant spent the rest of his life wandering the halls of Congress, a destitute ghost. He became a familiar, tragic figure in the Capitol. He carried a roll of tattered parchment, his original plan, and demanded payment for a job that no one understood. He died in poverty in 1825, clutching his sketches, claiming that the city was sleeping and that one day it would wake up. He was buried in a pauper's grave on a farm in Maryland, forgotten by the nation he helped build. But the story doesn't end there. In 1909, over a century later, something changed. The government suddenly took an interest in L'Enfant again. The commissioners of the District of Columbia exhumed his body from the obscure farm. Why the sudden honor after a century of silence? Because in 1909, the government realized L'Enfant was right. With the advent of radio and electricity, scientists began to detect the massive energy signals coming from the layout of the streets. They realized that the city was indeed a circuit board, and now that the Washington Monument was finished, the circuit was live. They needed to appease the architect. They needed his spirit to watch over the machine. They laid him in state at the Capitol Rotunda, the very center of the machine he designed. It is the highest honor America can bestow. Then they reburied him at Arlington National Cemetery on a high hill overlooking the city. His grave at Arlington is positioned with mathematical precision. It is not a random plot. If you stand at his tombstone and look out over the Potomac, your line of sight aligns directly with the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument, and the Capitol Dome. He is the eternal observer. He is the operator. The L'Enfant Cipher is the key to understanding American power. When you walk down Pennsylvania Avenue, you aren't just walking on asphalt. You are walking along a wire. When a president is inaugurated on the steps of the Capitol, they are standing at the focal point of a geometric lens designed to amplify their will. But there is a flaw in the design. L'Enfant never finished the safety valves. The energy accumulates, but it doesn't always dissipate. This explains the heaviness of the air in D.C., the oppressive atmosphere that hangs over the city even on sunny days. It explains why leaders who enter the city often change, becoming more aggressive, more paranoid, consumed by the need for power. They are suffering from radiation sickness. Not nuclear radiation, but the psychic radiation trapped in L'Enfant's grid. The city is a machine that runs on ambition. And Pierre Charles L'Enfant, the man who built it, is still watching from his hill, waiting for the day when the stars of Virgo align perfectly again and someone tries to pull the lever he couldn't reach. If you visit the United States Capitol building today, the tour guides will take you to the rotunda. They will show you the Apotheosis of Washington, painted on the ceiling. where George Washington is depicted ascending to the heavens, becoming a god. They will take you down to the crypt on the ground floor, a space originally designed to hold the president's body. They will tell you that the tomb is empty because Washington chose, in his humility, to be buried at Mount Vernon. This is the official story. It is a comforting lie. The tomb in the Capitol was never meant for a human body. It was built to be a containment chamber. It sits directly above the true heart of the American government, an object buried deep within the earth on September 18, 1793. History records this day as a grand ceremonial affair. We are told that President George Washington crossed the Potomac River to lay the cornerstone of the United States Capitol. We are told there was a parade, a barbecue, and speeches about liberty and democracy. But if you look at the paintings of that day, if you study the Masonic journals kept by the Lodge of Maryland, the picture changes. Washington did not arrive as a president. He arrived as a high priest. He was not wearing a military uniform or a statesman's suit. He was wearing the full regalia of a master mason, an apron embroidered with symbols that predate Christianity, a silver trowel, and heavy gloves. The history books say this was just tradition. The Shadow Dossier reveals it was protective gear. Washington knew that the Capitol was not just a building. It was the processor for the L'Enfant grid. Pierre Charles L'Enfant had laid out the circuit board of the city streets, aligning them with the constellations. Now Washington had to install the battery. The procession began at noon, but the air on Jenkins Hill, the site chosen for the Capitol, was heavy. Witnesses described a strange static charge in the atmosphere. Horses were skittish, refusing to cross the line of the foundation. The compasses of the surveyors were spinning wildly, unable to find north. The hill was a natural vortex, a tear in the energetic fabric of the land, and Washington was about to drive a spike right into its center. The excavation for the cornerstone was deep. It was cut into the sandstone bedrock on the southeast corner of the foundation. A crowd had gathered, citizens, soldiers, and dignitaries, but they were kept back by a cordon of armed guards. Only the initiated masons were allowed near the pit. Washington descended into the trench alone. He was 61 years old, his face weathered by war and the burden of founding a nation. In his hands, he carried a heavy box. Official records state that the time capsule placed under the cornerstone contained a silver plate with an inscription, along with newspapers and corn. This is the cover story, intended to make the ritual seem mundane. Newspapers rot, corn decays. The Founding Fathers were building for eternity. They would not bury garbage in the foundation of their empire. What Washington actually took out of that box was an object that had been recovered 10 years earlier by a covert naval expedition to the Yucatan Peninsula. It was a skull, but it was not human. It was carved from a single piece of quartz crystal, so pure it was almost invisible in the sunlight. It was dense, heavy, and cold to the touch. The jaw was articulated. The eyes were not empty sockets. They were lenses, cut with a precision that no 18th century tool could replicate. This was the jaguar's eye, a relic from a Mayan temple that had been abandoned centuries before Columbus set sail. The Maya had used it to channel the energy of the sun during their blood rituals. Washington intended to use it to channel the will of the people. As Washington stood in the pit holding the skull, the air around him began to distort.
The masons surrounding the rim of the pit began to chant. It was not a Christian hymn. It was a low, rhythmic hum designed to match the resonant frequency of the quartz. Washington placed the skull into the hollowed-out cavity of the bottom stone. He didn't just set it down, he aligned it. He rotated the skull until its crystal eyes were facing exactly east, toward the rising sun, and aligned perfectly with the avenue that would eventually lead to the Washington Monument. Then came the corn, wine, and oil. In Masonic ritual, these are symbols of prosperity, health, and peace. But in the alchemical ritual Washington was performing, they were chemical conductors. The corn was actually ground gold dust, a superconductor for the Earth's electrical currents. He sprinkled it over the cranium of the skull. The wine was a mercury-based solution, highly conductive and dangerous. He poured it carefully into the eyes of the skull. The oil was not olive oil. It was a lipid extracted from the bioluminescent glands of deep-sea creatures, a substance that glowed when exposed to static electricity. As the mixture hit the crystal skull, a reaction occurred. The skull lit up. A beam of intense prismatic light shot out of its eyes, striking the sandstone walls of the pit. The ground beneath Washington's feet shuddered. This wasn't an earthquake, it was the handshake. The artifact was connecting to the Earth's magnetic field. It was waking up. Washington fell to his knees. For a moment, the gathered Masons thought the president had suffered a stroke. His eyes rolled back, his hands convulsed. He wasn't dying. He was seeing. Just as the obsidian key had shown John White the future of the nation centuries prior, the crystal skull was showing Washington the architecture of power. He saw the dome that would one day rise above him, a massive iron shell acting as an amplifier. He saw the rotunda acting as a lens, focusing the psychic energy of every law passed, every speech given, every war declared, down into this very stone. He realized that the Capitol would not just house the government, it would amplify it. The skull would act as a psychic battery, feeding on the collective consciousness of the nation to keep the Union together. But he also saw the cost. The skull showed him the blood that would be spilled to keep the machine running. He saw the Civil War. He saw the brother fighting the brother. He saw the burning of the White House. He saw the assassinations. He realized that the entity within the crystal fed on conflict. To create a great empire, he had to plant a seed of violence. Washington gasped and pulled back, breaking the psychic link. The light in the skull dimmed to a steady rhythmic pulse, like a heartbeat. "It is done," he whispered. His voice was hoarse, as if he had been screaming for hours. The Grand Master of the Lodge handed Washington the silver trowel. Washington took a scoop of mortar, cement mixed with iron powder, and spread it over the cavity, sealing the skull inside. Then the massive top stone was lowered by a pulley system. As the stone settled into place with a thunderous thud, the static in the air vanished. The horses calmed down. The birds began to sing again. The circuit was closed. The machine was in standby mode, waiting for the building to be constructed on top of it. Washington climbed out of the pit. He looked aged. He looked terrified. He turned to the architect, Stephen Hallett, and gave a strict order. "Build it heavy," Washington said. "Build it strong, because what lies beneath must never see the sun again." The ceremony ended with a barbecue. The public celebrated, roasting an ox and drinking ale, completely unaware that their president had just installed an alien CPU into the motherboard of their democracy. But the ritual had side effects. In the years following 1793, the workers building the Capitol reported strange phenomena. Stonemasons heard whispering coming from the foundation stones. Tools would move on their own. Men would fall from scaffolds claiming they were pushed by invisible hands. The construction of the Capitol was plagued by fires, delays, and madness. The skull was hungry. It was drawing energy from the workers to charge itself. The architect, Hallett, was eventually fired, driven to near insanity by the voices in the walls. The true power of the cornerstone was revealed in 1814, during the War of 1814. When the British Army marched on Washington, they didn't just torch the White House randomly. They were guided by intelligence officers who knew about the cornerstone.
They knew about the esoteric power source of the American Republic. The British soldiers piled furniture in the Hall of Representatives and set it on fire. They wanted to generate enough heat to crack the foundation and expose the skull. They wanted to steal the battery. But they failed. The stone held, and then the machine defended itself. A sudden, violent storm appeared out of nowhere. It wasn't just rain. It was a hurricane that spawned tornadoes in the center of the city. The storm put out the fires and decimated the British troops. History calls it the storm that saved Washington. The Shadow Dossier calls it the Capitol's automated defense system. The skull manipulated the weather to protect its housing. Today, the cornerstone is officially lost. If you ask the architect of the Capitol where the original stone is, they will tell you they aren't sure. They have searched for it with radar and metal detectors, but they can't pinpoint it. They claim it was buried under later expansions of the building. This is another lie. They know exactly where it is, but they cannot acknowledge it because the area around the stone is radioactive, not with nuclear radiation, but with psionic radiation. The skull is still active. The crypt directly below the rotunda, the room with the 40 Dora columns, is the focal point. If you stand in the exact center of the crypt, where the compass star is inlaid in the floor, you are standing directly over the skull. Tour guides will tell you that the center of the crypt is the point from which all street numbers in Washington are measured. It is the 0 point. The Shadow Dossier tells you it is the connection point. Every inauguration, every State of the Union address happens directly above this object. When the president speaks, his voice is carried by microphones to the world, but his intent is carried by the crystal skull into the ley lines of the earth. It is a mass broadcast system for the subconscious. Why do you think the Capitol is treated like a temple? Why is the atmosphere inside so hushed, so heavy? Because you are walking inside a machine that is constantly running. George Washington went to his grave carrying the secret. He refused to be buried in the Capitol Crypt because he knew he couldn't rest in peace on top of that thing. He wanted to be at Mount Vernon, far away from the hum of the machine he had activated. The phrase Novus Ordo Secularum on the dollar bill means New Order of the Ages, but in the context of the cornerstone, it means something else. It means a new order of physics, a new order of control. So the next time you see the Capitol dome shining in the night, remember what holds it up. It isn't concrete. It isn't democracy. It is a crystal skull, buried in the dark, watching with eyes that have seen the rise and fall of civilizations long before America was even a name. The foundation is solid, but the house is haunted. This has been a file from the Shadow Dossier. Be careful where you step.
Eldridge in the future, the same color of the Agarthan energy. The air pressure dropped so rapidly that soldiers' ears popped. Birds fell out of the sky. General Ross looked up. He was a veteran of many campaigns. He knew weather. This wasn't weather. "Form ranks," he shouted. "Move to the high ground." But it was too late. The clouds above the Capitol began to rotate. They swirled into a kite-black funnel. A tornado formed. Tornadoes are incredibly rare in Washington, D.C. A tornado of this magnitude, forming instantly on a hot summer day, is statistically impossible. But this wasn't nature. This was the grid defending itself. The crystal skull, sensing its imminent destruction, had reversed its polarity. Instead of drawing energy down from the stars, it pushed energy up into the atmosphere. It ionized the air above the city, creating a massive vacuum. The tornado touched down. It didn't move randomly. It moved with intelligent purpose. It roared down Pennsylvania Avenue, ignoring the civilian houses and heading straight for the British occupation zones. It struck the British cannons, lifting the heavy iron guns into the air and tossing them like toys. It ripped the roofs off the buildings where the British officers were sleeping. And then the rain came. It wasn't a drizzle. It was a deluge. It was as if the Potomac River had been lifted into the sky and dropped on the city. The rain was torrential, violent, and deafening. The water poured into the hollow shell of the Capitol. It flooded the Supreme Court chamber. It hissed against the red-hot stones, creating clouds of steam that blinded the soldiers. In 20 minutes, the fires were out. The Greek fire, which water should not have been able to extinguish, was smothered by the sheer density of the downpour. The heat was sucked out of the stones. The foundation held. The cornerstone was safe. The British troops were terrified. They had fought the French, they had fought the Americans, but they had never fought a city that tried to kill them. "This is sorcery," a British lieutenant screamed, as the wind ripped the epaulettes off his uniform. The storm was selective. It killed British soldiers. It destroyed their ammunition wagons. The explosion of the gunpowder arsenal at Greenleaf's Point, which killed dozens of British soldiers, was triggered by a stray bolt of lightning from the storm. Admiral Cockburn and General Ross realized they were outmatched, not by the American army, which was scattered and useless, but by the American land. "We leave," Ross ordered. "We leave now." The British Army, the most powerful military force on the planet, fled Washington, D.C. in the middle of the night. They ran through the mud, battered by the wind, chased by the lightning. They didn't retreat because they were beaten by soldiers. They retreated because they were being hunted by the weather. The scars of the grid. When President Madison returned to the city days later, he found a ruin. The White House was a blackened shell. The Capitol was gutted. But the structures were standing. The architect of the Capitol, Benjamin Latrobe, surveyed the damage. He expected the walls to be structurally unsound due to the heat. Instead, he found something strange. The fire had hardened the sandstone. It had tempered the walls. The intense heat, followed by the rapid cooling of the storm, had calcified the building, making it stronger than it was before. The attack had failed. In fact, it had backfired. The trauma of the burning had charged the grid. The psychic energy of the destruction had fed the crystal skull. When they rebuilt the White House, they painted it white to cover the scorch marks. But under the layers of paint, the black char remains. It serves as a layer of carbon shielding, further insulating the building from external influence. The British invasion of 1814 effectively ended the Invisible College's attempts to destroy America through occult means. They realized that the L'Enfant grid was fully operational and self-defending. They switched tactics to economic and political manipulation, leading to the banking wars of the next century. But the storm of 1814 left a legacy. It proved that Washington, D.C. is not just a place where people live. It is a place that lives. The city has an immune system. There are records in the National Archives of the soldiers who died during the storm.
Their bodies were found twisted, not just by wind, but by compression, as if gravity had increased tenfold around them. They were crushed by the weight of the air. And the tornado? It dissipated as quickly as it had formed. Once the fires were out and the British were fleeing, the sun came out, the birds returned, the machine went back to standby mode. This event is taught in schools as the storm that saved Washington. It is presented as a quirky footnote of history, a bit of good luck for the young nation. The Shadow Dossier asks you to look closer. Luck doesn't target artillery wagons. Luck doesn't extinguish chemical fires. Luck doesn't appear exactly when the foundation of the empire is about to crack. The burning of the grid was the first stress test of the Apotheosis Project, and the machine passed. So when you look at the scorched pieces of the original White House timber preserved in the Smithsonian, know that you are looking at the remnants of a ritual that failed. The fire didn't purify the city. It forged it. This has been a file from the Shadow Dossier. The wind blows where it lists, but in Washington, the wind takes orders.
If you stand in the center of the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and look up, you will see the tallest stone structure in the world, the Washington Monument. It rises 555 feet into the air, a piercing white needle of marble and granite. It is the defining feature of the American skyline. But if you look closely, you will notice something strange. About 1/3 of the way up the monument, the color of the stone changes. It shifts from a lighter, smoother marble at the bottom to a slightly darker, rougher texture at the top. The official history books tell us that this line exists because construction was halted for 25 years due to a lack of funds and the chaos of the Civil War. They say the quarry used for the second half had stone of a slightly different shade. This is a convenient architectural excuse. The Shadow Dossier reveals that the line on the monument is not a scar of budgeting, it is a scar of war. It marks the moment the machine was turned off. The Washington Monument was never intended to be a mere tribute to the first president. George Washington didn't want a statue. He wanted a functional component for the grid he and L'Enfant had designed. The Capitol building was the processor. The White House was the command center. But the grid lacked an antenna. It lacked a way to draw the static electricity from the atmosphere and ground it into the ley lines of the city. They needed an obelisk. The Egyptians understood the technology. They didn't build obelisks as tombstones. They built them as tekenu, needles of the sun. They were placed in pairs at the entrance of temples to ionize the air and create a field of reverence and heightened awareness. In 1848, the Washington National Monument Society began construction. The architect, Robert Mills, had designed a massive structure. But the inner circle of the society knew the true specifications. The height, the width of the base, the angle of the pyramidion at the top, everything was calculated using sacred geometry. The monument was designed to vibrate at a specific frequency, a resonance that would harmonize with the crystal skull buried beneath the Capitol. On July 4, 1848, the cornerstone was laid. It was a grand Masonic ceremony, echoing the one George Washington had performed 50 years earlier. The Freemasons poured corn, wine, and oil. They consecrated the ground. The machine was begun. For 6 years the walls rose. The white marble of Maryland was laid block by block. The energy in the city began to shift. Sensitive people reported hearing a low hum when they walked near the construction site. Birds would refuse to fly over the unfinished stump. But as the tower climbed higher, it attracted the attention of a rival power, the Vatican.
In the mid-19th century, the Catholic Church watched the rise of the United States with deep suspicion. They saw a nation founded by Freemasons, Protestants, and occultists, a new Rome that threatened the spiritual monopoly of the old Rome. The Vatican's intelligence arm, the Entity, realized what the Americans were building. They recognized the design of the obelisk. They had one in the center of St. Peter's Square, stolen from Egypt by the Romans. They knew what it did. They knew that if the Washington Monument was completed, it would create an energetic shield around the American government, making it impervious to foreign influence. So the Vatican devised a plan to hijack the signal. In 1854, Pope Pius IX sent a gift to the United States. It was a block of marble taken from the ruins of the Temple of Concord in Rome. It was historic, beautiful, and seemingly a gesture of goodwill. The Pope asked that this memorial stone be built into the walls of the Washington Monument, alongside the stones donated by the states and civic groups. To the public, it was a nice gesture. To the Shadow Dossier, it was a Trojan horse. The stone from the Temple of Concord had been ritually charged. For centuries, it had absorbed the frequencies of Roman paganism and later the specific liturgical resonance of the Vatican. It acted like a virus. If this stone were inserted into the conductive masonry of the monument, it would alter the frequency of the entire tower. Instead of broadcasting the frequency of liberty and republic, the antenna would broadcast the frequency of subservience and dogma. It would essentially hack the American grid, turning the Washington Monument into a repeater tower for the Vatican. The American architects were unaware of the trap. They accepted the stone. They prepared to install it at the 150-foot level. But there were those who were watching. In the shadows of American politics, a new group had emerged. They called themselves the Native American Party, but the press called them the Know-Nothings. History remembers them as xenophobes, anti-immigrant bigots who hated Catholics and the Irish. And while their public face was indeed one of intolerance, their inner circle was a counterintelligence unit dedicated to protecting the Masonic purity of the United States. The Know-Nothings had spies in the Monument Society. They intercepted the communications regarding the Pope's stone. They consulted with their own geomancers. They realized the danger. They knew they couldn't petition Congress to stop the installation. The stone was a diplomatic gift. Rejecting it would cause an international incident. They had to act outside the law. On the night of March 6, 1854, the moon was hidden behind heavy clouds over the Potomac. The monument site was quiet. The tower stood about 150 feet tall, a jagged stump rising from the mud. A group of 10 men approached the site. They wore dark coats and masks. They moved with military precision. They were the Wide Awakes, the paramilitary wing of the Know-Nothing Party. They surprised the night watchman, binding and gagging him. They didn't hurt him, they just needed him out of the way. They made their way to the lapidarium, or shed where the memorial stones were stored before installation. They found the Pope's stone. It was a block of polished marble, inscribed with the words, "From the Pope of Rome." To a normal man, it looked like rock. To the Wide Awakes, who carried sensitive lodestones in their pockets, the block felt repulsive. It pushed against their hands with magnetic pressure. It felt heavy with old ghosts. They loaded the stone onto a handcart. It was incredibly heavy, far heavier than marble should be. They wheeled it out of the shed, struggling through the mud of the National Mall. They didn't smash it. Smashing it would just release the energy. They needed to drown it. They rolled the cart to the banks of the Potomac River, near what is now the tidal basin. The river was dark, swollen with spring rain. "Heave," the leader whispered. They pushed the stone into the water. It splashed and sank into the deep muck of the riverbed. As the stone hit the water, the air pressure on the mall suddenly dropped. The heaviness that the workers had felt for weeks lifted. The virus had been neutralized. But the theft of the stone triggered a catastrophe of a different kind. The next morning, the disappearance of the Pope's stone was front-page news. It was a scandal. The Catholic population was outraged. The donors who had funded the monument were horrified by the vandalism. The Know-Nothings didn't hide. They seized control of the Washington National Monument Society through a rigged election. They took over the construction site. They claimed they were protecting the monument from foreign influence. But the Know-Nothings were soldiers, not architects. They didn't know how to build the machine. They added 13 layers of masonry using inferior rock, but the geometry was wrong. The resonance failed. The public donations dried up. The money ran out. The construction stopped. For the next 25 years, the Washington Monument stood as an ugly, unfinished stump. It was 150 feet tall, a broken finger pointing at the sky. Mark Twain called it the hollow, oversized chimney. It became a national embarrassment. But the Shadow Dossier reveals that this pause was the most dangerous time in American history. The L'Enfant grid required 3 active nodes to function: the Capitol, the White House, and the monument. With the monument broken and inactive, the grid was unstable. The energy generated by the crystal skull under the Capitol had nowhere to go. It began to backfire. It created a feedback loop of dissonance. This dissonance manifested as political polarization. Is it a coincidence that the construction of the monument stopped in 1854 and the American Civil War began in 1861? The nation literally fractured because its metaphysical binding agent, the energy grid designed to keep the Union together, was offline. During the Civil War, the stump of the monument sat in the middle of a military camp. Union soldiers grazed their cattle around it. It was a symbol of a broken country. Abraham Lincoln, who understood the esoteric nature of the city, would look out the window of the White House and see the unfinished tower. He knew that until that needle was finished, the wound in the nation would not heal. It wasn't until 1876, a decade after the war, that Congress finally appropriated the money to finish the job. But by then, the original quarry was closed. They had to use stone from a different quarry in Massachusetts. This is why the color changes. When the Army Corps of Engineers took over the project, they had to correct the foundation. The Know-Nothings had messed up the alignment. The engineers, led by Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Casey, had to underpin the entire structure with concrete to support the massive weight of the obelisk. Construction resumed in 1879. As the walls rose again, the stump disappeared, swallowed by the soaring white shaft. But the most critical component was the tip, the capstone. An antenna needs a conductor at the very top to discharge the energy. Gold was too soft. Copper would turn green. They needed a metal that was highly conductive, resistant to corrosion, and precious. In 1884, the most precious metal on Earth was not gold. It was aluminum. At the time, the process to extract aluminum was incredibly difficult. It was worth more than silver. The government commissioned a 100-ounce cast piece of solid aluminum to be placed at the very apex of the monument. It was the largest piece of cast aluminum in the world at that time. Before it was placed, the capstone was put on display at Tiffany's in New York. People walked over it so they could say they walked over the top of the Washington Monument. But the inscription on the capstone reveals its true purpose. On the east side, facing the rising sun and the Capitol, are the words, Laus Deo, praise be to God. This wasn't just religious piety, It was an activation code. On December 6, 1884, the aluminum capstone was set in place. The moment the metal tip touched the stone, the circuit closed. Witnesses at the dedication ceremony reported a strange phenomenon. It was a cold, clear day, but when the capstone was set, a sudden gust of wind swept down the mall. The static electricity in the air became so intense that the hair of the politicians on the dais stood on end. The machine was online. The connection between the Capitol and the monument was re-established. The dissonance of the Civil War era was smoothed out. The United States entered the Gilded Age, a period of unprecedented industrial and economic expansion. The grid was working. It was amplifying the American ambition. But what happened to the Pope's stone? It remained at the bottom of the Potomac for decades, but the story goes that in the 1890s, a dredger cleaning the river hit a massive block of marble. The workers pulled it up. They saw the Latin inscription. They didn't return it to the monument. They knew the legends. They broke it up. Some pieces were kept as souvenirs by the secretive members of the local Masonic lodges, but the largest chunk was allegedly taken to a Jesuit university in Georgetown, where it is kept in a basement archive, shielded by lead glass. The Jesuits claim the stone still hums. They say that if you put your ear close to it, you can hear the chanting of a choir in Rome. It is still trying to broadcast the signal, but it has no antenna to transmit it. Today, the Washington Monument stands complete. It is the axis of the city. But if you visit on a stormy day, watch the apex. The monument is struck by lightning hundreds of times a year. Scientists say it is just a lightning rod protecting the city. The Shadow Dossier says it is a charger. Every lightning strike feeds the grid. Every storm powers the layout of the streets. The aluminum capstone glows with heat, channeling the fire of the gods down through the stone, down through the foundation, into the earth, and across the mall to the Capitol dome. The know-nothings are remembered as villains of history, but in the context of the Apotheosis Project, they were the guardians. They stopped a foreign virus from infecting the American operating system. They stole the stone to save the signal. The line on the monument is visible to everyone. It is a change in color, but now you know it is also a timeline. Below the line is the era of the founders. Above the line is the era of the empire, and the space in between, that is the era of the war for the soul of the machine. So when you look at the reflection of the monument in the reflecting pool, remember, you're not just looking at a stone tower. You're looking at the needle of a compass that steers the world. And it is always pointing up, waiting for the next bolt of lightning to keep the heart of the nation beating. This has been a file from the Shadow Dossier. The stone speaks, if you know how to listen. We are taught that on the night of April 14th, 1865, a disgruntled actor and Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth walked into the presidential box at Ford's Theater and murdered Abraham Lincoln. We are told it was an act of vengeance for the South, a desperate blow struck by a dying rebellion. We are told that Lincoln was a martyr for freedom, a casualty of the political hatred that had torn the country apart. But the Shadow Dossier reveals that politics was merely the surface narrative. The Civil War was not just a battle of armies. It was a catastrophic rupture of the energetic grid of the North American continent. The massive loss of life, 600,000 souls in 4 years, had flooded the land with a psychic trauma so dense it had cracked the foundation of the reality L'Enfant and Washington had built. The Apotheosis Project, the machine designed to turn the United States into a beacon of power, was broken. The ley lines were bleeding. The Washington Monument stood unfinished, a broken stump unable to vent the pressure. The crystal skull beneath the Capitol was screaming. Abraham Lincoln didn't die because he was hated. He died because the machine required a fuse. He wasn't assassinated. He was spent. To understand the sacrifice, you must understand the state of Washington, D.C. in the spring of 1865. The war was technically ending. Robert E. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox on April 9th. The Union was preserved. But the atmosphere in the Capitol was not one of joy. It was one of hysteria. The air felt electric, heavy, and suffocating. President Lincoln had changed. Photographs from 1861 show a strong, vigorous man. Photographs from 1865 show a ghost. His face was ravaged, his eyes deep and hollow. Historians say this was the stress of leadership. The dossier suggests it was resonance sickness. Lincoln was the head of the state. In the esoteric architecture of the Apotheosis Project, the president acts as the living capacitor. He is the focal point of the L'Enfant grid. For 4 years, Lincoln had absorbed the death and suffering of the nation directly into his own spirit. He was holding the Union together not just with laws, but with his own will. But the fracture was too deep. The South had been severed from the grid. The geomantic connection between the states was severed. To re-weld 2 pieces of iron, you need intense heat. To re-weld a nation, you need blood. Lincoln knew this. He was a deeply spiritual man, prone to visions and melancholia. He was not a Freemason like Washington, but he was a sensitive. He could hear the hum of the stones. In the weeks leading up to his death, Lincoln began to speak of his end with a terrifying certainty. He told his cabinet about a dream he had, a dream where he walked through the White House and found a catafalque guarded by soldiers. When he asked, "Who is dead in the White House?" the soldier replied, "The President." This wasn't a subconscious fear, it was a briefing. The entity within the Capitol cornerstone, the intelligence that guided the nation, had told him what had to be done. The war had unleashed a chaotic force, an egregore of hate and violence. This energy couldn't just dissipate, it had to be grounded. If it wasn't, the United States would dissolve into perpetual anarchy. The only way to ground that much energy was through the ritual death of the king. This is an ancient archetype known as the Fisher King. The land and the king are one. If the land is wounded, the king must die to heal it. Enter John Wilkes Booth. History paints Booth as a villain, a madman, but in the context of the ritual, he was the high priest of the execution. Booth was a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle, a secret society dedicated to the metaphysics of the South. But he was also an actor. He understood the power of the stage. He understood that for a ritual to work, it must be performed in public. It must be a spectacle. There is evidence to suggest that Lincoln and the forces moving Booth were in a silent, unconscious synchronicity. Lincoln stripped away his security detail that night. He specifically requested to go to the theater on Good Friday, the day of the crucifixion. The symbolism was intentional. He was preparing to lay down his life for the sins of the nation. The venue was Ford's Theater. A theater is a temple of emotion. It is a place where reality is suspended. At approximately 10:15 p.m., the play Our American Cousin was reaching its climax. The audience was laughing. The energy in the room was high. Booth approached the presidential box. He timed his entrance perfectly. He didn't burst in. He waited for a specific line in the play that would trigger the loudest laughter. A sonic mask for the shot. Lincoln sat in the rocking chair. He wasn't watching the play. He was staring into the middle distance. Witnesses said he looked peaceful, almost in a trance. He leaned forward as if waiting for something. Booth opened the door. He held a .44 caliber Derringer. It was a single-shot weapon, a single point of contact. He stepped forward. He didn't fire from a distance. He placed the gun almost against the back of the president's head. The shot was fired. The bullet was made of lead. In alchemy, lead is the metal of Saturn, the planet of death, weight, and finality. It is the metal used to shield radiation. When the lead ball entered Lincoln's brain, it didn't just kill him, it grounded him. The massive charge of psychic energy that Lincoln had been holding, the pain of the war, the fracture of the Union, was instantly discharged. Booth leaped from the box to the stage. He broke his leg on the landing. He shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. To the audience, it was a political slogan. To the ritual, it was the closing statement. The tyrant wasn't Lincoln the man. It was the burden of the war itself. The tyranny of chaos had been ended. But the ritual wasn't over. Lincoln didn't die in the theater. He was carried across the street to the Peterson house. He was laid diagonally on a bed that was too short for him. He lingered for 9 hours. This vigil was crucial. The energy was slowly leaving his body, dissipating into the city. Outside, a cold rain began to fall. The same kind of cleansing rain that had saved the city in 1814. The Enfant grid was resetting. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15th, Abraham Lincoln took his last breath. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton famously said, "Now he belongs to the ages." But the original transcript, scribbled by a doctor in the room, suggests Stanton said something else. He whispered, "Now he belongs to the engine." With the death of the president, the apotheosis was complete. The energy of the sacrifice surged through the ley lines of Washington, D.C. It rushed from the Peterson House down Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol. It flooded the Crystal Skull. It reactivated the dormant protection grid. But the healing of the nation required one final act: the stitching. Lincoln's body was placed on a funeral train. The train did not go directly to his home in Springfield, Illinois. It took a long, winding route. It traveled 1,600 miles, retracing the path Lincoln had taken to Washington 4 years earlier. It passed through Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Albany, Buffalo, Cleveland, Columbus, Indianapolis, and Chicago. This route wasn't just for mourners. The funeral train was a needle. As the body of the sacrificed king moved across the landscape, it acted as a magnet. It pulled the fractured energies of the North back together. Millions of Americans lined the tracks, weeping. Their collective grief was the mortar that repaired the cracks in the national psyche. By the time Lincoln was buried in Oak Ridge Cemetery, the Civil War was truly over. Not just legally, but metaphysically. The house divided had been pulled back together by the gravity of his death. But there was a cost. Lincoln's sacrifice altered the nature of the American presidency. Before 1865, the president was an administrator. After 1865, the president became a figurehead of near-religious power. The imperial presidency began with Lincoln because the office itself had been charged with the blood of a martyr. And what of the unfinished Washington Monument? The stump stood silent during the war, a symbol of the broken nation. But after the sacrifice, the energy to finish it returned. The grid was stable enough to support the tower again. When construction resumed years later, the stone was a different color, marking the timeline. Below the line was the Republic. Above the line was the Empire built on Lincoln's grave. There is a final chilling detail in the Shadow Dossier regarding the assassination. In the pockets of Lincoln's clothes on the night he died, they found 2 pairs of spectacles, a lens polisher, a pocket knife, a watch fob, and a wallet containing a $5 Confederate bill. But there was one item that was removed from the official inventory list: a small, rough piece of obsidian. It was the key, the same type of stone John White found at Roanoke, the same stone Benjamin Franklin charged with lightning. Lincoln had been carrying it. He had been the keeper. When Booth fired the shot, the key absorbed the flash. It recorded the event. The key was taken from Lincoln's body by Edwin Stanton and hidden away in the War Department archives. It remained there until 1947, when it was moved to a new facility in the Nevada desert, a place built to house things that do not belong to this world. Lincoln's death was a tragedy, yes, but in the secret history of America, it was an operation, a maintenance protocol. The Union was saved not by the sword, but by the altar. The Lincoln Memorial sits today at the west end of the National Mall. Inside, the massive statue of Lincoln sits on a throne looking out toward the Washington Monument and the Capitol. His hands are resting on the arms of the chair. One hand is clenched in a fist, symbolizing the strength of the war. The other hand is open, symbolizing the release of the sacrifice. He is the eternal guardian of the grid. He sits in the center of the machine he died to fix. This has been a file from the Shadow Dossier. The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. But sometimes the patriot and the tyrant are the same man, and the blood is the fuel that keeps the lights on.
Of history. Imagine a world where electricity was free, transmitted through the air like radio waves. A world where the Statue of Liberty was not a tourist attraction, but a power plant. The Masons left clues, as they always do. Look at the base of the Statue of Liberty. It sits inside a star-shaped fort, Fort Wood, an 11-pointed star. In sacred geometry, the 11-pointed star represents the Qliphoth, the realm of chaotic energy. They built the receiver inside a containment field designed to hold chaos. And look at the rays on the statue's crown. There are 7 rays. They represent the 7 seas and 7 continents, we are told. But they also represent the 7 colors of the spectrum, the 7 frequencies of visible light. The crown is a heat sink designed to vent the excess energy from the head. Today, the Statue of Liberty stands silent. She holds her torch, but it is lit by floodlights from the ground, a fake illumination. But sometimes, during a massive electrical storm in New York, photographers capture strange images. Lightning doesn't just strike the torch, it seems to be drawn to it. Bolts of electricity arc from the clouds and connect with the gold tip, not as a destructive force, but as a lover returning home. For a split second, the circuit tries to close. The copper skin remembers the charge. The secret torch was an attempt to unite the world not just in sentiment, but in energy. It failed because the technology was too dangerous.
Or perhaps because the powers that be, the oil barons, the coal tycoons, didn't want free energy. They wanted meters. They wanted wires. They wanted to sell what the lady wanted to give away. So the next time you see her, remember that she is not just a statue. She is a towering, silent machine, unplugged and asleep, waiting for a signal that may never come again. This has been a file from the Shadow Dossier. Liberty is enlightening the world, but the switch has been taped over. Reach into your pocket. Pull out a $1 bill. Look at the back. On the left side, you will see a pyramid. It is unfinished, consisting of 13 steps. At the top, floating in a radiant triangle, is an eye, the Eye of Providence. We are told that this is the Great Seal of the United States. We are told the pyramid represents strength and duration, and the eye represents God watching over the nation. We are told the Latin phrase annuit coeptis means he favors our undertakings, and novus ordo seclorum means new order of the ages. These are the explanations given to school children. They are simple, patriotic, and safe. But the Shadow Dossier reveals that the dollar bill is not just currency. It is a schematic. It is the most widely distributed map in human history. The symbols were placed there not by artists, but by occultists. And when Franklin Delano Roosevelt ordered this design in 1935, he wasn't just decorating money. He was distributing the location of the control room. The architect of the note. The year is 1935. The Great Depression has crippled America. The people are starving, desperate, and losing faith in the government. President Roosevelt knows he needs to do something to re-energize the national psyche. He launches the New Deal to fix the economy, but he also launches a secret project to fix the metaphysics. FDR was a 32nd degree Freemason. His vice president, Henry Wallace, was even more deeply involved in the esoteric. Wallace was a follower of Nicholas Roerich, a Russian mystic who searched the Himalayas for the mythical kingdom of Shambhala. One night in the Oval Office, Wallace brought a book to FDR. It wasn't a policy paper. It was a copy of the original design for the Great Seal, created in 1782, but never fully utilized. The power is dormant, Franklin. The L'Enfant grid is sleeping. The crystal skull is silent. We need to wake them up. We need to put the talisman in the hand of every citizen. They decided to redesign the $1 bill. They took the reverse of the Great Seal, the pyramid and the eye, which had been largely ignored for a century, and placed it prominently on the currency. The Treasury Department objected. They said the design was too Masonic, too strange. FDR overruled them. He personally sketched the final layout. He didn't just want the symbol, he wanted the geometry. The map hidden in paper. The dollar bill is designed to be folded. It is origami for spies. If you take a fresh bill and fold it in a specific sequence, bringing the ends together to form a tetrahedron, the lines on the back align perfectly. The pyramid becomes three-dimensional. But the true secret lies in the image itself. Look at the pyramid again. It has 13 steps. This represents the 13 colonies, yes, but in the L'Enfant Cipher, 13 is the number, of the base. Now look at the eye. It is surrounded by rays of light. Count the rays. There are specific groupings. If you overlay the image of the unfinished pyramid on a map of Washington, D.C., something terrifying happens. The base of the pyramid aligns with the west front of the Capitol building. The right edge aligns with Pennsylvania Avenue. The left edge aligns with Maryland Avenue.
And the eye, the floating capstone, it lands directly on the White House. But there is a missing piece. The pyramid on the bill is flat. The real map is three-dimensional. The unfinished nature of the pyramid means that the structure isn't on the surface. It is underground. FDR and Wallace knew that beneath the National Mall, connecting the Washington Monument, the Capitol, and the White House, there is a massive subterranean complex. It was built during the Civil War expansion, but kept off all public blueprints. It is called the Providence Chamber. This chamber is the control room for the entire Apotheosis machine. It is where the ley lines converge. It contains the master switch, a mechanism designed to amplify or dampen the psychic energy of the American population. By putting the map on the dollar bill, FDR was hiding it in the open. He was ensuring that the key to the machine could never be lost, because it would be reprinted millions of times a day. The ritual of exchange. Why put it on money? Because money is energy. It is current, hence currency. Every time a dollar bill is exchanged, it carries a charge. It passes from hand to hand, picking up the emotional residue of the transaction: greed, charity, desperation, hope. The eye on the bill acts as a psychic siphon. It watches the transaction. It feeds the energy back into the grid. When you hold a dollar, you are holding a tiny battery. When millions of people use the dollar every day, they are collectively powering the Providence Chamber. The U.S. economy isn't just a financial system. It is a massive, nationwide ritual designed to keep the entity beneath Washington, D.C. fed. This explains why the U.S. dollar became the world reserve currency. It wasn't just about oil or gold. It was about spreading the sigil. The more the dollar is used around the world, the wider the net becomes. The eye of Providence watches everyone. The spider in the web. Look closely at the top right corner of the bill, near the 1. You will see a tiny, almost microscopic shape hidden in the web-like border design. It looks like an owl or a spider. Conspiracy theorists claim it is the owl of Minerva, a symbol of the Bohemian Grove elite. Others say it is a spider, representing the web of control. The Shadow Dossier reveals it is a marker. It marks the location of the trapdoor. In the 1950s, during the renovation of the White House under President Truman, workers found a tunnel. It wasn't a standard escape route. It went straight down. It led to a heavy iron door stamped with the same owl-spider symbol found on the bill. Truman went down. He returned pale and shaken. He ordered the tunnel sealed with concrete. He told his aides, "There are things down there that do not vote." But the tunnel wasn't destroyed. It was just capped. The entrance is still there, hidden behind a false wall in the sub-basement of the West Wing. The missing capstone. The most significant detail on the bill is the gap between the flat top of the pyramid and the floating eye. The pyramid is unfinished. This means the machine is not fully active. The connection is broken. The capstone is a physical object. It is a massive triangular crystal, similar to the skull, but purely geometric. It was brought to America by the Templars long before Columbus.
It was supposed to be placed on top of the Great Pyramid of the Grid, metaphysically represented by the Washington Monument, but it was stolen. Where? Use the dollar bill. Fold it. When you fold the bill so the pyramid touches the eagle on the other side, the geometric lines point to a new location. They don't point to D.C. They point to a location in the American West. Some say it points to the Denver airport. Others say it points to Area 51. But FDR knew. He knew the capstone was hidden in a vault in Fort Knox. That is why Fort Knox is the most secure building on Earth. It isn't guarding the gold. The gold is just shielding. Gold blocks radiation. The massive piles of gold bullion in Fort Knox are there to dampen the signal of the capstone buried beneath them. If the capstone were ever retrieved and placed on the Washington Monument, the unfinished pyramid would be complete. The eye would descend. What would happen then? The apotheosis, the new order of ages would begin. The grid would fully activate. The minds of the American people would be synchronized. It would be the end of free will and the beginning of a hive mind controlled from the Providence Chamber. The legacy. FDR died in 1945, just as the atomic age was dawning. He never saw the completion of the work, but he left the map in our pockets. Every time you pay for a coffee, every time you tip a waiter, you are participating in the ritual. The phrase annuit coeptis means he favors our undertakings. It is not a prayer, it is a command. It means the machine is waiting. So the next time you look at a dollar bill, don't just see it as money. See it as a wiring diagram. The pyramid is the body of the nation. The eye is the intelligence that wants to rule it. And the gap between them, that represents you. That represents the little bit of freedom we have left before the capstone comes down. This has been a file from the Shadow Dossier. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance, but the price of power is printed on the bill.
Reinforced the spiritual bars of the cage. They were installing blast-resistant windows and Kevlar-reinforced walls, yes, but they were also reconsecrating the foundation. This brings us to the tragic events of September 11th, 2001, exactly 60 years to the day after the groundbreaking. When American Airlines Flight 77 struck the Pentagon, it didn't hit a random section. It hit the newly renovated Wedge 1. Conspiracy theorists argue about missiles and flight paths, but the Shadow Dossier asks you to look at the metaphysics. The attack struck the exact point where the reinforcement was strongest. It struck the seal. Some esoteric scholars believe the attack was a ritual attempt to break the containment. By smashing the pentagram, the attackers hoped to unleash the chaos trapped inside. The fire raged for days, but the building held. The geometry was damaged, but the loop was not broken. Following the attack, the reconstruction was swift. The Phoenix Project to rebuild the damaged wedge was completed in record time. Why? Because you cannot leave a hole in a prison wall. They weren't just rebuilding offices. They were patching the hull of a sinking ship. Today, the Pentagon stands as strong as ever. It is the nerve center of the American military, but it is also a tomb. Every day, 23,000 employees walk into that building. They swipe their badges, they drink their coffee, and they plan wars. They walk the 17 miles of corridors, oblivious to what lies beneath the terrazzo floors. They are the unwitting jailers. Their daily routine, their bureaucracy, their order. It is the grid that keeps the chaos at bay. The Ground Zero Cafe in the center courtyard has been rebuilt.
It is a pleasant place to eat lunch. You can sit there surrounded by 5 acres of grass and look up at the sky. It feels peaceful. But if you were to dig, if you were to bring a shovel to that courtyard and dig down past the manicured roots of the oak trees, past the steam pipes and the fiber optic cables, you would hit a layer of concrete mixed with iron and salt. And if you put your ear to that concrete, you wouldn't hear the silence of the earth. You would hear a sound like 1,000 radio stations playing at once. You would hear the scratching of something trying to climb up. The pentagon is not a symbol of defense. It is a symbol of imprisonment. We didn't build it to keep the enemy out. We built it to keep the enemy in.
If you visit Arlington National Cemetery, amidst the rows of white stones that stretch like teeth across the Virginia hills, there is one grave that draws the world. It is not marked by a cross or a statue. It is marked by fire, the eternal flame. It burns day and night, through rain and snow, a flickering orange tongue of gas dancing over a circular stone. We are told that this flame was the idea of Jacqueline Kennedy. We are told it is a symbol of memory, a promise that the spirit of John F. Kennedy will never die. We are told it is a tribute to a beloved leader cut down in his prime. But the Shadow Dossier reveals that the eternal flame is not a memorial. It is a seal. It is a pilot light for a metaphysical engine. John F. Kennedy was not assassinated by a lone gunman with a grudge. He wasn't killed by the Mafia, or the Cubans, or the Soviets. He was executed by the custodians of the Apotheosis Project because he committed the ultimate sin. He tried to turn the machine off. The year is 1963. The L'Enfant grid, the circuit board of Washington, D.C., laid out in 1791, is humming with unprecedented power. The Cold War has turned the psychic anxiety of the nation into a high-voltage current. The Pentagon, the containment vessel for chaos, is overflowing. The CIA has become the priesthood of this hidden technology. Kennedy enters this world as an outsider. He is the first Catholic president, a man outside the traditional Masonic lineage of the Founding Fathers. He is young, charismatic, and dangerously curious. Early in his presidency, Kennedy demanded full access to the Black Files. He uncovered the truth about the crystal skull beneath the Capitol. He read the logs of the Lincoln sacrifice. He saw the schematics of the Washington Monument antenna. He realized that the democracy he led was a sham. The government wasn't run by the people. It was run by the geometry of the city, which amplified the will of a shadow elite. The Apotheosis Project wasn't making men into gods. It was making them into monsters. It was feeding on the fear of the Cold War to sustain itself. Kennedy decided to shatter the system. He fired Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA and the high priest of the grid. He famously threatened to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. This wasn't a bureaucratic threat. He meant he was going to dismantle the occult structure that gave them power.
He planned to reveal the existence of the energy grid to the public. He wanted to retune the machine, to use the energy of the Capitol not for domination, but for peace. He wanted to end the Cold War, cooperate with the Soviets on space travel, and pull out of Vietnam. This was unacceptable to the grid. The machine runs on conflict. Peace is a lack of voltage. The Keepers, the modern descendants of the secret societies that built D.C., held a tribunal. They decided that the king must die.
But unlike Lincoln, whose death was a repair job, Kennedy's death had to be a locking ritual. They needed to pin the grid down so that no future president could ever tamper with it again. They needed a specific location. Washington, D.C. was too shielded. They needed a kill box. They chose Dallas, Texas. Dealey Plaza is not just a street intersection. If you look at it from the air, it is shaped like a pyramid with the capstone missing. It is located near the Trinity River, a site of ancient indigenous significance. The plaza was named after George Bannerman Dealey, a 33rd-degree Mason. It was built as an outdoor temple to the sun. On November 22, 1963, the trap was set. The motorcade route was changed at the last minute. It was routed through Dealey Plaza, forcing the limousine to make a slow 120-degree turn. This turn broke the momentum of the vehicle and placed the president in the center of the geometric trap. The crowds cheered. The psychic energy was high. At 12:30 p.m., the shots rang out. The official story says Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots from the book depository. The Shadow Dossier reveals that Oswald was a patsy, a distractor element. The kill shot did not come from a rifle. It came from a triangulated crossfire designed to create a kinetic grounding. When the final bullet struck the president, it didn't just end the life. It released a massive, sudden burst of psychic energy. Kennedy, young and beloved, was a vessel of hope. When that vessel was shattered on live television or film that would soon be seen by the world, the collective trauma of the human race created a shockwave. Millions of people screamed. Millions of people cried. That emotion is energy, and the grid drank it. But the ritual wasn't finished in Dallas. The energy had been released, but it had to be captured. It had to be anchored. This brings us to the funeral and the flame. Jacqueline Kennedy was in shock, covered in her husband's blood. But in the hours after the death, she made a strange request. She didn't want a standard headstone. She demanded an eternal flame. She insisted on it with a ferocity that baffled the architects of Arlington. She had seen the flame at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Paris, but this was different. She was being guided. Whether by her own intuition or by the subtle manipulation of the keepers, she was demanding the final component of the ritual. The location of the grave was chosen with mathematical precision. Kennedy is buried on a slope in Arlington National Cemetery. If you draw a straight line from the center of the eternal flame, it crosses the Potomac River, passes directly through the center of the Lincoln Memorial, runs down the National Mall, pierces the Washington Monument, and ends in the dome of the Capitol. It is the axis of death. On November 25th, the state funeral took place. It was a masterpiece of occult theater. The riderless horse, the veiled widow, the weeping nation. When Jacqueline Kennedy took the torch and lit the gas jet at the head of the grave, she wasn't just lighting a fire, she was soldering the circuit. The eternal flame acts as a frequency lock. Fire is plasma. Plasma interacts with electromagnetic fields. By keeping a flame burning 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, directly aligned with the DC grid, the keepers created a permanent signal jammer. The energy of the Kennedy assassination, the trauma, the grief, the lost potential, is trapped in a loop between the grave and the Capitol. It creates a barrier. It ensures that the apotheosis machine remains in its current setting, perpetual war. Kennedy wanted to end the conflict. Instead, his soul was used to fuel it. Since 1963, the grid has been locked. Think about it. Has any president since Kennedy truly challenged the intelligence agencies? Has anyone tried to dismantle the military-industrial complex? No. They fall in line. They expand the surveillance state. They feed the pentagon, because they can feel the weight of the lock. They know that the king of Camelot is sleeping on the hill, watching them, burning as a warning. The flame has gone out only a handful of times. In 1963, holy water sprinkled by a Catholic priest accidentally doused it. It was relit immediately. In 1965, the gas line was severed. In 1967, a torrential rainstorm drowned it. Each time the flame goes out, the grid flickers. There are reports that during these outages, strange things happen in the Capitol. Computers crash. Politicians suffer sudden strokes. The ghosts of the basement become violent. So the military ensures it never goes out. The gas line was upgraded. A flashing electric igniter was installed to relight it instantly if the wind blows too hard. They cannot afford to let the signal die. The eternal flame is a beautiful lie. It looks like love. It looks like remembrance. But in the language of the Shadow Dossier, it is a prison bar. John F. Kennedy is not resting in peace. He is working. His legacy is being used to power the very thing he tried to destroy. He is the battery that keeps the deep state running. And the crowds that visit the grave every day, the tourists who stand there in silence, staring into the fire, they are doing exactly what they're supposed to do. They are recharging the battery with their attention. They are maintaining the field. The assassination was not a crime. It was a correction. The machine malfunctioned, so they replaced the part. And to make sure it never broke again, they welded the hood shut with fire. This has been a file from the Shadow Dossier. The flame burns not to remember the dead, but to control the living.
For 200 years, the city of Washington, D.C. has been waiting. From L'Enfant's original map to the burning of 1814, from Lincoln's sacrifice to the eternal flame of Kennedy, every event has been a gear turning in a clockwork mechanism too vast for the human eye to see. We have walked through the streets, paid with the dollar bills, and looked up at the monuments, never realizing that the machine was incomplete. It was missing a piece. The Great Seal on the dollar bill shows a pyramid with the capstone floating above it. We are told this represents the eye of God, or the unfinished nature of the American experiment. But the Shadow Dossier reveals the terrifying literal truth. The pyramid is unfinished because the physical capstone, the final component of the Apotheosis machine, was stolen. It was hidden away by a faction of the Founding Fathers who realized too late what they had built. They knew that if the capstone were ever placed on top of the Washington Monument, the grid would fully activate. And the result would not be freedom. It would be total control. This brings us to the present day. Dr. Elias Thorne is not a treasure hunter. He is an architectural historian at the Library of Congress. He spends his days scanning the fragile, crumbling blueprints of the Capitol's construction. He is a man of dust and paper. But one rainy Tuesday in November, he finds something that shouldn't exist. Hidden inside the binding of a ledger belonging to Benjamin Latrobe, the second architect of the Capitol, is a letter. It is written in a cipher used by the Freemasons of the 18th century. Thorne breaks the code. The letter reveals the location of the lost triangle. The capstone wasn't destroyed. It was buried, but not in a grave. It was buried in a vault beneath the one building in America designed to hold the weight of the world's wealth, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. It sits 80 feet below street level in a cage of gold bullion. The gold acts as a shield, dampening the signal of the crystal artifact. Thorne realizes the timing is critical. He looks at the astronomical charts.
The constellation Virgo is returning to the exact position it held in 1791 when L'Enfant first tried to activate the grid. The star Spica is aligning with the tip of the Washington Monument. The window of ascension is opening. Thorne isn't the only one who knows. The Keepers, the shadow cabal that orchestrated the Lincoln and Kennedy sacrifices, have been waiting for this alignment for centuries. They control the surveillance state. They control the algorithms. And they know Thorne has found the letter. Thorne's apartment is tossed. His digital files are erased. He goes on the run. He realizes he has to get to the capstone before they do, or perhaps he has to destroy it. The chase leads him to New York City. He infiltrates the Federal Reserve, not with a gun, but with knowledge. He knows the old maintenance tunnels, the pneumatic mail tubes that connect the city's oldest buildings. He bypasses the modern security by using the forgotten infrastructure of the past. He reaches the vault. The gold bars are stacked like walls, but in the center, on a pedestal of simple granite, sits the object. It is a pyramid of pure, translucent crystal, about the size of a basketball. It pulses with a soft violet light. It hums. It sings to the fillings in his teeth. Thorne reaches out. The moment his finger touches the smooth surface, he sees it. The vision. He sees the Washington Monument, but it isn't stone. It is a beam of white light shooting into space. He sees the Capitol dome acting as a receiver, broadcasting a signal that overrides the free will of every human being on the continent. He sees a Pax Americana where there is no war, no crime, and no dissent, because there is no choice. The apotheosis isn't about becoming gods. It's about surrendering to one. It's a hive mind, Thorne whispers. Suddenly, the vault door hisses. The Keepers have found him. Men in tactical gear, wearing patches with the eye of Providence, storm the room. But they don't shoot. You don't shoot in a room full of gold, and you certainly don't shoot near the artifact. A man steps forward. He is older, wearing a suit that costs more than Thorne's life. He is the director. Dr. Thorne, you have no idea what you are holding. That stone is the only thing that can save us. Save us? Thorne laughs nervously, clutching the heavy crystal. It's a leash. The world is chaos, Doctor. Look at the news. War, famine, collapse. Humanity is failing. We built this country to be a beacon of order. The founders knew that true liberty leads to anarchy. The ascension will bring peace. It will align the human frequency. No more pain, no more division. At the cost of our souls, Thorne counters. A small price for survival. The director steps closer. Give it to me. The alignment is tonight. The helicopter is waiting to take it to the mall. We place it on the monument, and the world heals. Thorne looks at the crystal. He feels its seduction. It promises order. It promises an end to the fear and anxiety that had plagued the nation since 1963. It feels good. But then he remembers Lincoln. He remembers the resonance sickness. He remembers the men fused to the deck of the USS Eldridge. He realizes that this machine doesn't care about human life. It only cares about function. Thorne makes a choice. He doesn't hand it over. He smashes it. He lifts the heavy crystal capstone and brings it down with all his strength on the corner of a gold bar. The sound is deafening. It isn't the sound of glass breaking. It is the sound of a bell tolling. A shock wave of violet energy explodes from the fracture. The vault shakes. The lights blow out. The tactical team is thrown back by a concussive blast of pure psychic force. Thorne falls to the ground, his hands burned, the crystal shattered into 1,000 glowing shards. The hum stops. The director screams, "You fool! You've doomed us all!" But Thorne smiles in the darkness. The connection is broken. The Washington Monument remains an unfinished antenna. The grid is dead. Or is it? In the aftermath, Thorne is arrested. He disappears into a black site, never to be seen again. The official story is a failed bank robbery. The shards of the crystal are swept up and locked away in a new facility, deeper than the first. But back in Washington, D.C., something has changed. Tourists visiting the Washington Monument report feeling lighter. The oppressive atmosphere of the city seems to lift. Politicians begin to speak of cooperation. The polarization cracks just a little. But on the dollar bill, the pyramid remains unfinished. The eye still floats above it, waiting. The Apotheosis Project failed this time, but the blueprints are still there. The lines are still laid out, and somewhere, in another vault, or perhaps coming from the sky itself, there might be another capstone. The stars will align again. The cycle is not broken. It is merely delayed. We walk through the city of gods, unaware that the machinery is just beneath the pavement. We are the current running through the wires, and as long as the monuments stand, the potential for activation remains. Look at the obelisk. Look at the dome. They are not just stone. They are the hardware. And they are waiting for the software update. This concludes the Shadow Dossier. The file is closed. But the eye never blinks.